Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Okay, I think we have critical mass to get going here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bob O'Brien. I'm Director of Planning and Development for the City of Revere. And the mayor has requested that I moderate this master planning process for the Riverfront District. This is the first of 4 public meetings on that subject. All of these meetings are being both recorded and broadcast on YouTube and Revere TV, just so everyone is aware of that. This process is being funded by the Seaport Economic Council, an arm of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's a group co-chaired by Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, and it is focused primarily on issues having to do with Seaport and Seacoast economic development. And they thought that the riverfront opportunity was high on their list of priorities. So they have supported this effort. This is the first phase of a process which will, once the master plan is complete, lead to a considerable number of other steps, including funding, zoning, permitting, the vision that emerges from this master planning process. So as the mayor said, we want to be both aspirational and pragmatic so that it's something that we can really make happen once we conceive the strategy for what we want to do to improve this district. The focus of attention is Gibson Park and the public-private properties that surround Gibson Park. We had a meeting of the advisory group appointed by the mayor last week to discuss the scope and schedule of this process. And at that time, it was made clear from the perspective of the city that there were a number of opportunities that we wanted to be quite clear at the outset. The first is that with regard to the very contentious Riverside Boatworks, which has had a lot of unsuccessful development proposals, which had neither the support of the community nor the city, that the city is open to the longstanding suggestion from the Riverside community that this property should be made available for some community and public use. So we are very much open to that possibility. Have had that discussion with the owner of Riverside Boatworks. He is also open to that possibility. So that is very much on the table for discussion. Second, with regard to Gibson Park itself, we are very much interested in developing the waterfront aspect of that project. It's a park that exists on the waterfront, but it does not take advantage of that location. And we would very much like to see that waterfront watershed element of Gibson Park pursued and developed in this master plan. We are also hopeful that we will have some solution to the access and egress issues from Gibson Park, which is now somewhat difficult to get into and get out of, and practically nobody can get there without going through the Riverside community, which is also not an ideal arrangement. So we are hoping to have some strategy for improving access and egress as well as its waterfront potential. One of the critical parcels abutting Gibson Park is the G&J parcel, which has been occupied for many years by the G&J Towing Company. As was made clear in our meeting last week, that project is now available for development, and it has been put under agreement with Gennaro and Giulio by the Redgate Capital Development Group, which has been very active elsewhere in Revere. Redgate has done 500 Ocean Avenue, which is the parcel that includes the well-known Drift restaurant. They have done one Beachmont, on the former site of the Saratani's supermarket, and they are developing other properties on Ocean Avenue as well. Redgate very much knows Revere, and Revere knows Redgate. They have had an investment in the community in excess of $250 million thus far. And I think they see real potential for the residential development of the G&J site, which will make a major contribution to improving this gateway parcel. It's also worthy of note that the GE Bridge, the General Edwards Bridge, is going to be redeveloped and replaced. It should be noted that that in and of itself is important to the Revere community as well as to Lynn, but equally important is the fact that the new profile in the bridge is going to require a completely different circulation pattern of access to and from the bridge, which has both issues and opportunities for the Revere community. We will be discussing those as well. The Point of Pines Yacht Club is a very important part of the Riverfront district, and we consider them very much a part of the strategy to enhance waterfront and watershed uses. The city of Revere is also going to be putting in a new Point of Pines fire station in the Riverfront district. That will also be part of our discussion. All of these issues and opportunities are in the context of our recognition that there are some serious environmental issues surrounding this community. Not least is the persistent flooding problem in the Riverside community and particularly along Mills Avenue. We are looking to see how all of the redevelopment of the Riverfront community that we will be looking at will also be able to make an impact on solving some of those problems. So that is kind of the scope of the issues and opportunities that we will be looking at during the course of the next 4 weeks. I would also note that we have been very much advantaged by the fact that we have a very informed advisory group. And for those of you new to this call who may not be aware of who was on the advisory group appointed by the mayor, let me just run quickly down who they are. In terms of community participants from the Riverside community and the Riverside Association, Loretta LaCentra and Elaine Hurley, who probably don't need any introduction to the people on this phone call. Also is Eric Lampadecchia, who was born and brought up in the Riverside community and is a community advocate for this district and other elements of the city of Revere, knows the district well and brings a lot of local knowledge to the table. From the Point of Pines community, which is the other neighborhood that is adjacent to the Riverfront district and very much impacted by it, we have Gina Vanderloop from the Point of Pines resident, who also is involved with the Point of Pines Beach Association and the Alliance for Health and the Environment. Bob Mara, recently retired as the mayor's chief of staff, also a Point of Pine resident, and John Shue from the Point of Pines as well. The last community resident is Jay Bolton from the Point of Pines Yacht Club. We have 4 elected officials who are on the advisory group. Ward Councilor John Powers, City Council President Patrick Keefe, Jessica Giannino, who is both City Councilor and State Representative-elect, and Rosalie Vincent, who is and has long been our state representative and will continue to be so until she is succeeded by Jessica in January. From the city staff, we have Frank Stringy, longtime chief planner for the city of Revere and chairman of the Site Plan Review Committee, who is very knowledgeable about this district. Nick Molason, who is the chair of the Revere Conservation Commission. Jean McKenna, who is the chair of the Revere Planning Board, before which whatever master plan proposals come out of this group will be going. Elle Baker, who is our open space and environmental planner. Julie DeMauro, who is our transportation planner. Paul Rupp, longtime Revere development consultant, and myself. So we have, I think, a very knowledgeable group. We also have the benefit of a very competent consultant team headed up by Arrow Street, a very well-known planning and architectural firm, very active in Revere on other projects throughout the city, including projects with Redgate Capital. They will be assisted in this effort by Copley Wolff and by the engineering firm of Lloyd's Register. I will leave it to David to introduce the member of his team and give a little background on what it is they bring to the table. We will have essentially 4 meetings of this group, 1 tonight, 1 next week, and then 2 in December on the 3rd and the 10th. This first meeting will look at the overview of existing conditions, including existing efforts, planning efforts that have preceded and prepared for this process. The second meeting will look at site-specific solutions to some of the issues and opportunities that will be identified in this meeting. The third meeting will look at the development and transportation issues, including the G&J site and adjacent properties, and the whole issue of access and egress to Gibson Park and all of the surrounding properties. And the final session will be looking at the strategies for implementing all of these visions and proposals and strategies that we agree upon. Just a little by way of housekeeping, this is obviously a virtual meeting. It is the first master planning virtual meeting that we have done, so we ask you for some patience. The meetings are going to be organized around presentations from our consultant group, but the presentations are not meant to be lectures. They are meant to be dialogue, a conversation. So the members of the advisory group are encouraged and welcome to ask questions and make observations during the course of these presentations. And the members of the audience will also be invited to have their questions and observations at the break in each of the elements of the presentation. So hopefully everyone will have an opportunity to get in. For the members of the audience, just indicate by the electronic indication of a raised hand that you want to ask a question, and we'll make sure that we get to you. I think that's about it. We ask you for your patience. I would ask just one other thing. For those people in the audience, could you please identify yourself by your own proper name? And when you do speak, I will ask you to identify your name and affiliation. But I think some people just have a zip code or something like that. It would be very helpful so we know who's asking the question if we know you by your proper name. So with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to David Boyes and Amy Corte from Arrow Street, who will introduce their colleagues on the development team and take us through the presentation. Before I do that, are there any questions at this stage in the process? Seeing none, I'll turn it over to David and Amy. David?
Thanks, Bob. At first, I want to just quickly introduce our team and appreciate the nice introduction, Bob. We are Arrow Street. Can you? We are architecture and planning firm and have been doing work in Revere for over 14 years. We were involved in the master planning of Waterfront Square, the work with the MBTA, DCR, the Marquee Bridge, as well as private development projects. So we're very familiar with the city and have enjoyed working in your city for the last 14 years. We also have a research group and master planning. And one of the things that we've spent a lot of time focusing on is site resiliency. So we hope that we bring a lot to the table along with our colleagues. With me tonight is Amy Corte, my partner, as Bob said, from Copley Wolff, Sean Sanger, a landscape architect that fortunately is right upstairs. We do a ton of work with them, work in Revere and elsewhere, and they have extensive experience on riverfront and waterfront park development. And also with us tonight are John McAllister and Jay Borkland from Lloyd's Register. They will be, they've been working in Saugus on the Saugus River and have extensive experience in the environmental concerns of areas such as this. So a great addition to our team as well. Just quickly want to go over what we're going to try to do tonight. So what we want to do is talk about the process that we have in front of us. We are going to go through both the existing conditions. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the environmental and resiliency challenges and some of the processes that we have to go through so that we all understand, what's at stake here and what the process is to get things approved. And we also want to talk about potential. And we really hope that you engage with us, have questions along the way. And as Bob said, make this a conversation. We're going to show a lot of precedents and a lot of early ideas so that the next time we meet, we'll be ready to have at least the first round of planning to talk about very specific solutions for your city. The site is about 19 acres, and it extends from the Boatworks to the Point of Pines Yacht Club and takes up some of the section of Route 1A, including the off-ramps. So it's not just Gibson Park, it's not just G&J, it's also the Mirage site. And we're trying to figure out how, in this process, we're trying to figure out what makes the most sense for the city and how to bring this area to become that gateway from the north. There are very specific areas, they're A through G, that have been included in this grant that we're going to study. So the first is the Boatworks and the concept of trying to get community access to the waterfront. Second is Gibson Park and improving the resiliency in Gibson Park. And hopefully, we'll be working to develop strategies that not only improve the resiliency, they improve access and the utility of the park, and then also improve the conditions on Mills Ave. The third site is the water's edge along the G&J site. We're going to talk a little bit about Chapter 91 and those impacts on the potential development in this area. Chapter 91, and John will go into more detail, but basically it's a waterfront regulation that really limits what you can do in that first section, and talk about how we can make Riverwalk and waterfront improvements to the land there. And we'll show you some pictures that talk about the current conditions. The private development site is the G&J site, and that we'll talk about in detail at the third meeting, as well as the Mirage site and potential ideas for what we can do there. Also, we're going to look at the potential for connections to the marina and how that might work, and other resiliency improvements that we can make in that area. And then finally is and Bob mentioned the General Edwards Bridge. We'll talk a little bit about that, but that's really a longer term project. But we're hoping that as part of all this, that we can work with Mass DOT and make some improvements to the ramp systems there and reclaim some of that land for connection to Gibson Park. So aerial of the site, you can see, obviously there's the great, asset of the park, which is bordered by two kind of underutilized assets. Our goal is to try to figure out how to change that. Currently, these are pictures from, several walks that we have taken. G&J, obviously, There are conditions where there are dilapidated docks. There are shoreline conditions that, just don't meet environmental, regulations. There are also some nice conditions with marsh and, along Gibson Park. So the hope is that the feel and the character of the entire edge is something that at the end of the master plan, we have a roadmap to move forward and build a community waterfront. Again, this is a map that we got from the city, just again, kind of showing in just a different way, a little bit clearer, the extent of the site. Do you want to talk about the boatworks a little bit?
Yeah, so the first site that we'll be looking at, both from the resiliency, the flooding, the landscape potential, and then really the potential uses and opportunities to potentially reclaim this building. It's actually got some great bones. We walked it a couple of days ago with Ellen Frank. We're able to see inside and get some photos inside of the building, and really it presents an opportunity. Some of the things that we've heard from the community, especially from the first meeting, do you have a community boating site, access to the water? And we're really looking for ideas. And so would love to use this first meeting to solicit additional ideas for what you see this building, this site in particular becoming. We've also been talking with Copley Wolff and Lloyd's Register on how we could really look at the water's edge along the site to hopefully work with the plan that Elle Baker from the city is working on in terms of the resiliency. And so helping to rebuild this water's edge to prevent and to make the riverfront community more resilient to flooding on the daily basis. And so while the flooding won't be the main focus of this, anything that we do propose in terms of boardwalk, riverwalk, any shoreline improvements, the ultimate goal of that would be to both help you as a community have access to the water, but also to, whether it's raise the barrier, make it more resilient, to increase precipitation, which we'll hear about more from Jay and John, and to additional sea level rise.
And the picture here on the lower left is actually kind of that weak point in the system. It's the lower area. And, the real challenge here on this particular site is going to be creating real viable, useful riverfront access and rebuilding resiliency at the same time.
This is a photo of the interior of that building.
Gibson Park is, it's a great asset. It's a little bit hampered in terms of access. It forces the access through the Riverside neighborhood. So we're going to look at ways to actually improve that so that we can get more use out of it and less impact on the surrounding neighborhoods.
In addition, we think there's ways to improve the waterfront connectivity. Currently, people are cutting through the natural grasses and the wetlands and the reeds to basically step down and access the water. And your access to the water are these smaller gravel areas, smaller beaches. And so some things that Sean, John, and Jay will be exploring in the upcoming weeks are really, how could we begin to get a continuous boardwalk along the site? Are there opportunities in the park to expand it with additional amenities for the community? We'd love to hear ideas during this first meeting. What are those additional amenities that you envision for your neighborhood? How might we connect this better to the water and the water sheet? And what else would you like to see in your park that would help support, the community?
The northern part of the site, it's a couple of different pieces. It's the G&J site, it's the Mirage site, and the Point of Pines Yacht Club access. There's also potential for reuse of the existing pier, redevelopment of that, whether that, and John and Jay will talk about this a little bit more, but whether that requires dredging, we're going to look at that to see if we can make that a more viable pier, whether it's, and we'd love to hear from you what the use of that pier would be, whether it's a fishing pier, whether it's just for observation, what kind of uses you'd like to see there, or whether we want to try to find ways to get actual boating at that point.
Yeah, so you can really see between the exit ramps, the Riverside Boatworks, and then a lot of this, the shoreline, one can imagine that you could, almost double the impact of Gibson Park and really create some connections that connect pedestrian-friendly paths, more activity for walking, really expand this more passive recreational path along the water.
And also, and just going back to that for 1 second, you can see too, the idea of, figuring out a way to get from 1A to Gibson Park, as opposed to having to always go through, at the moment, Riverside neighborhood, or, we don't want to just push that traffic into the Point of Pines neighborhood though.
So just some pictures of the shoreline now. This is the G&J site, the pier, some of the conditions along the shoreline, really, the community deserves better. And so we look forward to really representing that and figuring out how to make that happen.
I think we heard multiple times in our meeting last week that, the advisory board members have all been, driving past this and trying to imagine what could be here. So I want to turn it over to John and Jay to talk a little bit about some of the environmental opportunities.
David, I think we had a question from one of the members of the audience, Chris Edge. Chris, if you could identify yourself and perhaps your address and affiliation, and feel free to ask your question.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Chris, can you hear me?
Chris, you're on mute.
I'm not Chris, I'm Jay, sorry.
Oh, Jay, well, that's why we can't find you.
Maybe that's why you guys don't let me into the video.
Oh, we're gonna put you in now, Jay.
Okay.
All right, thanks,
All
Jay.
right, let me in, thanks, guys. Thanks, Julie.
Sorry.
No problem. So I just want to add that, like, as some of the process.
Okay, go ahead. Hold on 1 second.
Let me undo myself. Oh, there I am. Wow, look at this. It's amazing. So as some of the boathouse conversations we're going through over the past few years, and most of you know, we had some meetings at the yacht club on this particular subject. The yacht club was spoke to some of the other people actually on this board about potentially assisting, right? We know what it's like to run a yacht club. We know what it's like to run a function hall, a marina, and things of this nature. As we go forward, I'd like to still try to uncover those possibilities and see if it's something that both the city and the yacht club would want to undertake together. I know that they maybe some of the contractors and so forth have some other ideas on that. I know that things have changed a little bit after we found out that the gentleman wanted to put 40 units over there, and that was a little bit different. But I think that together we can make this whole area a lot better. And I just want to say that the yacht club's behind the city and behind the development of this property, and we look forward to it. So I just want to throw that out there. So thanks for letting me into the meeting. I'll change my name from Chris now.
Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, Jay.
Okay, David, back to you.
All right, I'll pick it up from here if that's all right. Good evening, everyone. John McAllister from Lloyd's Register. Just picking up on what David was talking about, we are looking at different development opportunities and how we can make this site maximize its potential, but we have to do that within the regulatory frame of what we're up against. So there are several several regulations that are pertinent, but I'm just going to touch on the most, I want to say restrictive, but the ones that really can drive where we're going to go with this. The first one obviously is the floodplain. As anyone knows, this area is relatively low lying, so there is pretty much the entire site, except for the ball fields and North Shore Road, are within the floodplain. So we have to make sure we're not exacerbating any uses within the floodplain, and we want to make it better. Then there's state regulations. This portion, a lot of Gibson Park, a lot of the Riverside part of the study area is within the Rumney Marsh area of critical environmental concern. Now, area of critical environmental concern, there are 30 of them in the Commonwealth, and what they are, they're really high value, but also under high pressure for development areas of environmental concern, as the name implies. And this one was set aside in 1988. It's about 2,800 acres that it encompasses, but it's got a great biological diversity that needs to be protected. And so things like salt marsh and subtidal habitat are very critical in this area. So that's one of the things we'll have to keep in mind. The other thing is we have the Pines River and the Saugus River coming together. So we have Riverfront area. So there's the Massachusetts Rivers Protection Act and the Wetlands Protection Act that really govern how we develop within that riverfront area. They have setbacks and buffers, and that's administered through the Conservation Commission and the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Then the last one, also through DEP, that David had touched on earlier, is the Chapter 91. That's the Public Waterfront Act. That's, and I might be making this up, but I believe that's the oldest in the country, back from 1866 was when that legislation was enacted. And what it was intended to do was make sure that all historical and current tidelands, that there are protections in place to maximize public access so that, you know, everyone can have access to the waterfront and get there. So it encourages water dependent uses, but even with non-water dependent uses, there are access and regulations that'll put in place to get people the ability to get out to the waterfront and to appreciate this natural resource that we're so lucky to have in Massachusetts. And then obviously there's local regulations. You know, Frank and I'll talk about this, site plan reviews, everything like that. But there's just a kind of a matrix of items that we'll be looking at, and every idea we come up with kind of has to be bounced off and gone through the checklist to make sure it complies or that it'll be allowable under those different scenarios. So if we can go to the next slide, please. One of the things I want to talk about, we are within the floodplain, but we're also at prime risk for sea level rise. So if you look at the big blue image on the side, that's from NOAA. They have a sea level rise viewer, which is pretty cool. You can kind of just scroll on the side, go up and down just to see what different scenarios will look like. And this is a 4-foot sea rise, and you can see most of our study area along Riverside is going to be underwater at mean high water. And that's, I chose 4 feet because, as you can see up here, the National Climate Assessment Board assumes, and this is a very conservative 4-foot sea level rise by 2100. So that's a real, and it's coming. And then if you look down at the bottom left, you'll see, right there, everything that's green is good, but the red and the orange means you're really at risk, higher probability for flood exceedances. And so that's really, again, most of our study area. That's for 2070. That's very hot off the press data from the MPO. So sea level rise is certainly something we want to take into account too, because we don't want to just solve for problems that are happening today. We have to plan for potentially 4 more feet of water coming into this area. So it's a significant challenge. If we can go to the next one, please. And now we already have our flooding and vulnerability, but I just want to point your attention on the right, these 2 graphs. In the top, you have the bar. It's nationally. You can see there's about a 40% rise in heavy precipitation events over the past decade. But if you look down at the map of the U.S. in our region, we're really pulling up the average, 71%. So we're getting a lot more storms. They're a lot more intense, and it's really the intensity that drives it. Because if you get 2 inches of rain over 24 hours, it's not nearly as bad the flooding as 2 inches of rain over 6 hours. It's just the intensity. They don't have enough time, the system, to keep up. And if that happens at high tide, then you're just compounding it. So again, these are the things that we're going to be designing for. We're not going to go for the traditional storm events that we use. I think those were developed based on rainfall data from the 60s. So that's kind of outdated. We're getting much more frequent, more higher storm events that we need to plan for when we're laying out our stormwater infrastructure. If we can move on, please. So I'm going to pass this over to Jay. He's going to talk about some of the interventions that we're going to be reviewing. Jay?
Thank you, John. And a couple of things that I just wanted to bring up. We're going to talk about something called interventions. What we mean by interventions, and this is kind of the language that's used now by resilient scientists around the world. We mean things that can be done to the landscape that really improve, they make an area more resilient, and they improve its resistance to flooding and storm damage. And so we're going to show some examples of some interventions that we think would be at least partially applicable here at this site. A note that a lot of the interventions that we're showing, a lot of these ideas come from something called, it was a competition that John and I were very involved with after Hurricane Sandy, and it was called Rebuild by Design. And you can Google Rebuild by Design, and you can look at the whole pantheon of interventions that were developed after Hurricane Sandy in this design competition that was set up by Housing and Urban Development and funded under the Obama administration with $1 billion to rebuild the coastlines of New Jersey and New York. And the idea was, as John was just saying, is to not continually simply rebuild the same coastline in the same way, which just leaves everybody open to future storms, which are just getting worse. But it is to look at what the trends are in terms of those storm intensity increases and adjust and develop really innovative designs that will both protect the landscape and the communities and also be great amenities when flooding isn't occurring. And so the watchwords that came out of that competition were designed for the norm as well as the storm. 80% of the time when there isn't a storm, people are going to be able to utilize these structures and these interventions, and they create really nice amenities. So if you think of, Gibson Park and, the pathways and things that currently exist there, and you think about sort of amplifying that amenity, but also protecting and creating protection from flooding for both the park area and also alleviating some of the flooding that occurs to the south in the Mills Avenue area. And so, these interventions we're showing here are things like adding salt marsh areas that then have public access walkways across them, which become both educational and enjoyable aspects. It includes berms that are natural, along with living shoreline in the lower left there. There's a terraced berm structure along the coast, which we think is quite applicable here for the area from the G&J towing down through to the Boatworks site, with a living shoreline, it's called, right along the water's edge, where you use the kind of vegetation that is resistant to being eroded by storm flow. And then in the lower right, it allows you to create some really interesting amenities like viewing platforms that can be accessed from the tops of the berms and are extended out to the river's edge so that you can go and enjoy the view and look at the natural setting that the marsh area off to the north provides. Thank you. Next slide. I think, John, you take over again, right?
Sure, yeah. So up here, what we have is kind of talking about design, as Jay mentioned, designing for the norm and designing for the storm. So actually the norm is on the top right. That's the park. This is actually from the Copenhagen Flood Master Plan. But they have the park where you have all that green area, and you can see there's a little berm with a walkway along the top, so that for most of the time when it's along the riverside, it's just a nice green park. But you make the choice where you'd rather than have a neighborhood flood over on the left side, you let the park flood. So the green space gets flooded. It becomes a blue-green park, we call it. But it's useful flood storage area that's not in roadways, in neighborhoods. It's an area where it's a controlled environment, and you have that berm that can kind of direct it into those areas. So that's one thing right there. And then
John,
below,
if I could interrupt you for just a moment, I believe Loretta Lucentra has a question. Loretta?
Sure.
Loretta, as you know, is a
yeah.
Riverside resident.
So thank you, Bob, for that. I just had a quick question. You mentioned the flooding interventions that you're proposing at Gibson Park. Is there any indication of how well that those interventions will protect the southern end of the Riverside neighborhood itself?
the northern end of the Riverside neighborhood, and like you're talking from Thayer south?
From Thayer Avenue to the southern end of the Riverside neighborhood, correct?
The entire race.
Right. So yeah. So well, we're not proposing anything just yet. This is what we're going to be studying in the coming weeks. But actually, great segue. I don't know if you're a plant forest, but that brings me to my next protection. So the stuff that's in Gibson Park on the surface, that's really going to be for the river surge storage. But for flooding that happens in the Riverside area, one of the items we were thinking about doing is down here. If you look on the subsurface detention, is at high tide or at certain events, there's just not enough time for the water to discharge. So it needs to have an outlet or a place to be stored. Now, we don't want a big surface detention pond that just takes up space and isn't functional. So they have items. This one, it's kind of a cross section through it. It looks almost like a bridge with a soccer field on top of it. But what that's showing is that we can provide some offline storage where the water, rather than backs up on the street, it backs up underneath the park or underneath the boatworks area. It'll have to be sized appropriately to handle that storm. And then as the tide recedes, it'll slowly allow it to drain out, or it can percolate back into the groundwater. Now, a lot of that's going to be dependent on where the groundwater table is to see how much volume we can get. But even with shallow chambers, you can still buy some storage volume and buy yourself some time, so that as the tide recedes, you're getting multiple solutions. So it's not going to be one silver bullet. It's going to have to be multiple interventions to make things better.
I see.
Is that
Thank you for that explanation. Just, I may be getting ahead of the agenda, but routing that water underneath the boatyard, as you probably know, that area has been a boatyard for the better part of a century, with the attendant pollution and contamination that comes with a site like that. So like I said, I may be getting ahead of myself, and if so, then we can save that question for another time. But I have some environmental concerns about the soil in that area.
Oh, absolutely, and that would definitely be investigated. And you're right. I mean, a boatyard, you're going to have oils and greases. You're going to have fuel, hydrocarbons, and you're going to have metals. So that certainly is a consideration. But also the boatyard, as you know, I think David showed on it, it's actually the lowest part, so it's not the most ideal. So we might actually just bypass the boatyard and go underneath Gibson Park with some of that stuff to take advantage of the higher table water ground level.
I see.
As you're thinking about these things, are you taking the whole peninsula into consideration, so that it's not? I mean, my thinking is if you shore up one side, does that potentially cause issues in the Point of Pines section?
You're absolutely right, and that's something we do have to consider. And it's actually not allowed under the regulations, but you can't, fix one problem to exacerbate in another area. And that's one thing we have to be very cognizant about. That's why we're not really going to be proposing any filling per se. If we fill, there's going to be a balance where it's offset somewhere else, where it's a net zero. Because you don't want to push the problem, fix it in one place and exacerbate a problem or create a new problem somewhere else. So
I'm sorry so you're thinking through, or those things will be articulated, correct?
Yes,
correct.
Absolutely.
And we like to call so what's come out of the vernacular for resiliency is sort of talking about sculpting the land and making storage available, so that when flooding occurs, there's places for the water to go that don't create a hazard, right? They're not flooding neighborhoods or what have you. We're going to do our best to use the gradations that we have between the water table and the land surface, sculpt some of the land that we're talking about. We may even be talking about raising some areas in Gibson Park where we lower other areas. There may be a combination of underground storage for water, for stormwater, as well as some superficial ponds, which can be essentially, marshes and amenities and interesting features. But we're going to do our best to try to create some level of relief during flooding for the Mills Avenue area. We may not be able to take care of the entire problem within this project area, but we will certainly be tying into the situation and then making recommendations for sort of future aspects of what you will be designing this to take more water, hopefully, than is needed in the immediate, and some of that design can then be worked south in future phases of work.
Yeah, I also wanted to just mention that we're going to talk in a little bit, Elle Baker from the city is going to talk in a little bit about some of the other studies that are going on at the same time. So this is just one piece of the overall strategy for this area.
John, can I just ask a question following up on Gina's? I can see where something, if it's not done carefully in Gibson Park, could actually exacerbate the Mills Avenue situation rather than improve it, and obviously you're going to avoid that. Is there any likelihood, though, that what you do on the Riverside side of Route 1A would have an adverse effect on the Point of Pines? Would the adverse effect, if there is one, extend that far?
It's unlikely, but it's certainly something that we would look at just to make sure. You kind of have to water. For its credit, it's very simple. It seeks the lowest points. You can always just kind of model it, just see if it's going to build up to X elevation, where would X elevation spill over to, and you can see where the water goes. So it's certainly something we'll look at, but I don't think it is likely that it would, because you actually have that natural barrier of North Shore Road. It has its own stormwater infrastructure on it that'll kind of be the cutoff.
But part of your work will be a flow analysis, so you know where the water is coming from, going to, et cetera.
Yeah, that's one of the things we have to look at, so we know, so we can make the recommendations.
No, Nick Malayson has his hand up, as does Jay. Nick, why don't we start, and Loretta as well, and Eric. So we'll start with Nick first.
Okay. So I know obviously the big concern is the flooding, and I know we want to take care of Mills Ave, but I also want to take care of North Shore Road, and I'm not sure if it can be part of this process to make sure North Shore Road up to the marina is taken care of as well. Because the last 2 or 3 years of storms, that road has been pretty much shut down from Oak Island to GE Bridge. So I want to do whatever we end up incorporating, Bob, and I'm not sure if it can be part of this project or something that we can call the Army Corps of Engineers to be involved with or something, but we need to get North Shore Road somehow into this project as well.
Yeah.
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
So later on, we do have a slide that actually talks about some other projects that are happening virtually simultaneous to this. One of them is the Army Corps, but another one is the Metropolitan Planning Organization has just recently taken on a resiliency study for Route 1A, the full length of Route 1A. Actually, John has in one of his slides, one of the mapping items that came out as a result of that study. So this particular study is sort of focused on this 19-acre parcel, but obviously we'll be very cognizant of all the other surrounding areas. And there are studies that are happening. So there's that one. And then we have the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Action Grant, which is a feasibility study for coastal resilience. And that loops all the way, Point of Pines, all the way down to the Marina Restaurant.
Perfect. All right, thank you.
They're happening sort of simultaneously. You will see elements of things that will be in that study, in this study as well. So there'll be some overlap.
Great.
As far as perimeter, this particular study is pretty much limited to the 19-acre parcel, but obviously would consider any impacts that they would have on surrounding areas. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that was very helpful.
And Jay.
Eric, I believe you had a question, then Jay, and perhaps Loretta as well. Eric?
Hi, guys. I just wanted to piggyback off of the previous topic on surficial storage and existing pollution in the area. I know we talked about the existing pollution in the boatyard, but we did not talk about the existing sediments that are along the Pines River. Have we done any kind of water quality study? I mean, if we're going to explore a surficial storage option, I just have some concerns, particularly around existing sediments in the Pines River, as well as what I'll call the perfect storm if Wheelabrator were to flood. And let's say some of that carcinogenic ash floated upstream and ended up in Gibson Park, and the type of disaster that might present. So I just wanted to put that on the table and just explore if we've considered water quality, and maybe you guys could speak to that topic.
I'll start on that. So yes, water quality, I did talk about the other permitting agencies, but anytime you're touching sediments within the river, it falls in the waterway, you have another section of Mass DEP, their waterways, it's called the 401 water quality certification. So you would have to do sampling, and they have target analytics that they want you to look for, certain ones, and then you'd have to also get a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. So anytime you're doing work within waters of the US, you have multiple layers where you'd have to test, show what kind of risks there are, perform a risk assessment for, will this exacerbate it? How will this protect it? You know, public health is always a very important thing up front on that. So we haven't done any sampling. We've had some conversations about some historical sampling, and I know that there was some applications to do some dredging out, at least by the boatworks for the marina. So that has been considered, and we do have some ideas for actually how to contain that if we do any dredging. One of the things we're talking about, you could actually do a hydraulic dredge, which is kind of where you mix it with, it's like a giant hose vacuum, where you mix it with water and it comes into like a slurry, and you can pump that into what's called a geobag. And that geobag, it can be used to create a new berm. It can be used for a base for a marsh. It can be used to stop some sand accretion. So it's kind of a beneficial reuse of those contaminated sediments, and it's contained within this geobag too. So it's kind of a double benefit, a triple benefit, I guess, because you're dredging, you're reusing, and you're protecting. So that's an option that we could look at if the situation could present itself. Again, that could be for shoreline protection, could be, you know, to support a seawall, even just they can be planted as well, but it depends on the material that goes into it.
Eric, I would also note that at Gina's suggestion, we have invited DEP to participate in these discussions. Thus far, they have been unresponsive, but we will try to get them involved. Clearly, at some point, they become involved as a regulator, but it would be helpful if they could contribute to the planning as well. Jay Bolton from the Yacht Club.
Thanks, Bob. A few things. I think that potentially Jessica and or Rosalie could be beneficial in getting the DEP on board. They have helped us in the past. Right now, the Yacht Club is in the process of applying for a dredging permit. I just want you guys to know that. The sand from the last 3 tropical storms last year put a lot of sand where the boats are, and we need it gone. So we're talking about replenishing the berms along the Point of Pines Yacht Club, and we're working with the DEP to try to figure that out. So as we move forward, John and Jay, I think we should connect and figure out what's in the best interest of your project. One more thing I want to add is that, you know, the floodplains. We had a meeting at the Yacht Club not too long ago. It seems like a long time ago with this COVID thing, but looking at a 20-year plan, a 30-year plan, a 50-year plan. And obviously, most of us know that the pump station down at the Yacht Club property is key to getting rid of rainwater, floodwater, sending it back to the ocean. So John and Jay, I want to make sure that you know about that, and that as you move forward, it's part of your plan to try to mitigate that issue.
Correct. Yes, we are aware of it. Ellen and Frank had provided us with the information on that, and you're absolutely right. That is a crucial piece of infrastructure that needs to be protected and obviously kept functional.
I see John Flowers with his hands up.
Yeah.
John's muted, John.
Unmute, Council Powers.
Hey,
Hello? Go ahead, John.
we got you.
I have a couple of concerns, and of course they are related to flooding. I think the first question that we need to address is, or one of the first questions would be to determine what would be going in on the 9.25 acres that comprises the G&J property, because that's going to be very instrumental in how we deal with the flooding down there. We have to know where we're going with that. I think the other concern I have is the traffic plan. What's it going to do, not only to Riverside, but to the Point of Pines itself? Right now, we've got the turn off there off of 1A on John Ave on Lancaster. Where is this traffic going to come off of 1A and get over to the proposed development at the G&J site? So these are major concerns that I have. I also think that one of our first projects would be to acquire the boatyard site. If we have to use free cash, we've got something like $8 million in free cash. They also have like $150,000 in outstanding fines that were levied upon them for the condition of their property a few years ago. And I say it would be wise to address that as soon as possible, because, you know, I had the support of my colleagues to amend the zoning down there to eliminate anything but a one-family home. That could change down the road, you know, the longer that lingers there. So that's something I'd like to see addressed right away. And to do that, we're going to require the use of free cash, I believe, because I don't see any other way that property could be purchased. And the other thing I'd like to know is what happens with the old property there where the nightclub was? Is that being included as part of this? Because it doesn't, this is records, it all shows us that the G&J is assessed for 9.25 acres of property down there. So these are some of the questions and concerns that I have. As far as the pump on the Rice Avenue, the surface water pump, that was just rebuilt. We had that rebuilt, and there's another pump in there that probably should be rebuilt at some point. So these are my concerns. So
John, this is Bob. You've identified several critical issues, all of which are going to be addressed in this process. The issues of development and transportation, as well as the Mirage site, which are really critical, are all going to be addressed as almost the sole focus of our attention on the meeting on December 3rd, right after Thanksgiving. They are critical issues. We understand that they need to be addressed as part of the whole planning for this process, and they will. With regard to the Riverside Boatworks property, we have already begun discussions with the current owner about the inclination of the city to purchase this property for community use. Free cash is certainly one possibility for funding such a purchase, but there are also funds available from the Commonwealth that are useful to purchase property for inclusion in expanded parkland. So some combination of these, I think, is going to allow this property to be purchased for the kinds of purposes that will be envisioned in this group. We have told the owner that we first want to get a vision for how we reuse the community before we actually enter into serious negotiations about its purchase. But it's very definitely on the table, John, and will be addressed within the context of this discussion.
Well, Bob, just one comment. I think that whatever happens at the G&J property, or whatever happens, when it happens, how it happens, I think to protect the people in Riverside, one of the most important facets of this project is to make sure that we have control of that property down there so that nothing goes in there as was proposed over decades in the past. End of story.
Completely understood, John. the Riverside Boatworks has been, you know, the focal point of our attention for a long time. And of course, the community use has been proposed by the Riverside community for a long time. So we understand that completely. As for the G&J site, it's likely that the development of that property, which would be for residential, not commercial purposes, is precisely what will allow some of the shoreline improvements that we are envisioning here to occur and to be funded and to be maintained. So I think it's all part of the process, but those issues will be focused on in the third meeting of this group.
Excuse me, Bob, did I hear you say residential and not commercial?
That's correct.
So there'd be no commercial whatsoever there, restaurant, shops, anything like that?
Well, let me be clear. There could be a mix of uses, but primarily residential. And yes, depending on what the community wants, commercial uses, including those kinds of uses, especially if they're indicated as preferences and priorities of this community, we will work with the developer to make sure they're part of the plan.
Thank you.
Okay, John. Loretta, did you have your hand up?
I did. Thank you.
Okay.
One more question. Has again, I'm maybe getting ahead of myself, but has the Redstone development had any talks about what their flooding interventions look like at that site? You've talked about the boatyard and the Gibson Park, but not addressed G&J directly.
Well, that's Redgate, not Redstone, I think, Loretta. But yes, that will be part of the conversation. They will own a large portion of the waterfront, which will be subject to the Chapter 91 requirements, as has been indicated. And yes, they will be very much part of that conversation.
Okay.
Gina?
Yes, just real quickly, and I know this is a future meeting, the third meeting, but it would be helpful just to provide some context to existing conditions. If you guys could give us just a very high level of what is actually going to be proposed for the G&J site. I know you said it's under agreement, under development. Clearly, there must be some vision for, you know, how many units, what is this, you know, how high, et cetera, because I do think that would be at least helpful for some of the context that we're talking now.
Understood. We will get into all of those levels of detail. I'm not sure we're down to the how many units, but certainly the massing and orientation of the property will be on the agenda. And even before that, we'll be talking about what is going to happen along the waterfront. Indeed, I think Sean may have some indications of those possibilities in the rest of this meeting. But the waterfront will be on the agenda for the first and second meeting, even before we get to the development scenario.
I think we're going to move on to the rest of the presentation.
John, I don't know whether you're completed with your presentation, but pick up where you left off and we can get Sean involved as well.
Sure, yeah, I'll just quickly touch on these last two slides. The last slide actually we kind of already touched on, but just here looking, we have this is just what we call the bioswale. It's a more of a water quality feature actually, and we talked about contamination. So this you use the vegetation and the soil to absorb your suspended solids, and that's if there's any pollutants in the runoff, it gets captured in there so that it doesn't go into the water body. And it's easier to maintain and collect because it's concentrated, not concentrated in terms of densities, just it's in one point, it's easy to access. And then the other one is just a profile of, you know, if we do a berm or if we do a raised walkway, how we can show some underground storage chambers and different utilities that can be brought in. And again, because if you have utilities there, you're going to want to raise them up, because if sea level's rising, the groundwater level's rising, and you don't want your electrical, your telephone, your communications, even your water, your sewer, you don't want that sitting in groundwater, because pipes get old, they leak. And, you know, for sewer pipes, that's a major problem if you start having an infiltration and inflow. So those are just some of the things we're going to be exploring. This is obviously a very knowledgeable and passionate group. So we're getting a lot of good feedback and stuff. And I'm hoping when we come back next week, which is actually what the next slide is, if you don't mind just going to it. When we come back next week and for the future sessions, we're really going to be focused on doing some big interventions here, but the G&J property and even the northern riverfront areas, those are all going to be part of our focus. I don't want to say the advantages, but for any redevelopment or new development in that northern part, the G&J property and other parcels, they're going to be subject to both the City of Revere's standards and the Mass DEP. We talked about the Wetland Protection Act standards, which has their Massachusetts stormwater policy, which has 10 standards that have to be met. Well, unless they get a waiver, but they really have to be met, which is taking care of volume, flow rates, and water quality. So the redevelopment will have to meet those. So it will go a long way to alleviating flooding just in complying with the standards. And then anything we do above and beyond that is really for resiliency and added cushion. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sean, who's got some really, really cool stuff to talk about in terms of other interventions. Thank you all.
Thanks, John. So in addition to all of the amazing technical challenges, opportunities that we have as a design team, it'll be a very collaborative effort. Is at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're able to maintain and keep an amazing waterfront, but also an amazing green open space amenity for the neighbors and the community broader. So there's going to be a lot of different ways we can do that, and these are all really meant to be more of kind of precedent or stimulate a conversation of what we want to keep in mind or what we want to be able to hear from you guys for certainly other opportunities, but certainly understanding a good section of Gibson Park, beautiful lawn, and keeping that really flexible and multi-purpose, whether that's building upon the ball field that's there and transitioning more to a multi-purpose kind of activity. I'm just picking up on things that we heard during our call last week, but certainly the ability to design it and grade it such that we can start to incorporate flag football, youth soccer, keeping the ball field there. From what we understood, it was more of a practice field, making sure that's still really the case. But then also start to think about other community events or neighborhood events. You could start to certainly set up utilities to make sure that we could do smaller group gatherings. You could do movie nights. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, and maybe this will start to become even more of a magnet once we kind of make the pedestrian and the bike connection stronger from the adjacent neighborhoods and really kind of build upon the potential certainly for this amazing amenity right here along the water's edge, and keeping it really flexible. And whether that's throwing a Frisbee, having a dog out there throwing a ball, kites, you name it, but it's a great open space. And just to think about the quality of that, in addition to obviously the stormwater elements that we're going to make sure we weave into the overall design here. Go to the next. Certainly the ability to integrate pathways, as John and Jay both mentioned. There could be opportunities in the upper left to have more of a boardwalk character to start to integrate people and the plant material, where we have more of a seasonal water element. At the same time, we want to make sure we're keeping the really strong pathways that currently run through there. We may think about different locations or different layouts as a part of this, but wanting to make sure that we're still having the benches, the more passive kind of activities, the walking, whether it's individuals or more family biking. We're not talking really any kind of commuter kind of speed biking in this location. This is definitely really more park and family focused. So, I picture this being more kids, kind of a safer element within the space. Likewise, jogging, just once again, really trying to make and connect the desire lines and the pathways to the neighborhood themselves, and just making this easier to get to throughout the design process. And honestly, just being able to, I think, take advantage of this great little green gem that we have out there, and to be able to make that easier to get to and to utilize. The photo in the middle certainly is downtown Boston. It's much more urban, and by no means am I kind of saying that's what's going to Gibson Park. But I will say there are locations where, depending upon how the development site starts to evolve, and that water's edge will be certainly different proximity to the building and the water's edge than what we have certainly down through the majority of Gibson Park. So I think there'll be some interesting variety of character and spaces that will be developed, and hopefully that will create these little nooks that people like to hang out. Maybe they find their little hidden spots to read a book or just kind of chill on a great day, certain times of the year. But I think the ability to kind of have a variety of spaces that will be woven together through pathways and connections will be really, I think, an amazing amenity for the neighborhood. And then likewise, we've talked about this as well during our last call, but it really, you've got this great park that's on the water, and the ability now is what can we do to get to the water? And whether that's, we've talked about the public pier, getting you out to the water and really out in the water, obviously being above it is certainly one way. The upper right is whether those are paths that Amy kind of mentioned down around the boathouse, boatyard area. But once again, the ability to get down to the water. I live in the North End here, and it's amazing to be able to watch people take their dogs to the water and they throw the balls out and the dogs chase them in. But you've just got the ability to get into the water and kind of touch it and interact with it, certainly during the certain times of the year. But whether those are seating areas, whether those are paths, obviously we've got government agencies that are going to regulate some of that. So we'll have to work through those processes. But certainly, once again, to be able to get people to interact with the water, whether that's fishing, touching, strolling, visually. The lower right is certainly, we've talked about the ability to get people on the water. This just happens to be a kayak shot, but once again, people in the water, on the water, above the water, the lower left then too is maybe it's not, well, in addition to the piers, I should say, maybe there are the opportunities for some overlooks as well. Once again, they're a little smaller scale. It's a little more interactive with the water's edge, but once again, you're just really increasing your ability to visually and physically interact with the water. And then Jay and John mentioned and kind of talked about the landforms, and I want to talk about that just a little bit more. I mean, I think this is where it'll be really fun as a design team to once again collaborate between disciplines, but the ability to take these landforms and make those such that they're a very functional and a design quality within the overall park. We definitely don't want to lose sight of the park and the needs for those open spaces for recreation and play. So, but at the same time, we can really take the landform, which is obviously pretty flat, and use those forms to our advantage. You can imagine if you've got some kids and more of a youth soccer game or a flag football game, you could use these slopes as really more of spectator seating. So there's a lot of different ways to take the topography and use that to our advantage and really make this a multifunctional, flexible, but also kind of integrating kind of the opportunities here. And you can imagine that happening within these really soft landforms. And in the upper right, I mean, these are pretty big areas, but it doesn't take much to kind of slope those grades up, and it doesn't feel like it's quite as abrupt as what you're seeing certainly on the upper left when you start to spread that out and understanding the grades. And then where areas get a little tighter, I don't know, but we've done seating, we've done amphitheaters, you could do spectator seating, but you could also use really more of an architectural element, is what you're seeing in the center there of little walls that stair step up and start to terrace to integrate some of those grade changes where things get a little bit tighter. It's just another way of kind of thinking about that from a programming standpoint. And then in the lower, actually on the middle and the lower right, and there's a lot of these out there that are pretty amazing, but we've done a lot of work with just salvaged old seawall stones that are certainly got a lot of history and a lot of character that certainly speak to the area, the waterfront as well, that make amazing kind of seat wall elements and at the same time provide some protection certainly from waves and wave action. So it starts to act as these vertical buffers that will help us. So not one of these is really an end solution, but I think they're things we should all think about and talk about as we really get into the programming, if you will, and the opportunities to kind of build upon what is currently in Gibson Park. It's a great space. And I think within the kind of the rethinking of the technical opportunities here it's really kind of working this together on all fronts. Likewise, the plant material will definitely be a part of the equation. It's going to help us with water area or areas that hold water. Likewise, it will act as a buffer as well from incoming water. So it's a great erosion control and slope stabilization material. Likewise, in the upper right, I kind of pulled that picture in. It's obviously a big park that's down in New York. It's one of their new ones that have been going in as a part of their resiliency programs. But what you start to see there is really a layering between the topography, lawn areas, planted areas, the paths, some of the pier overlooks. Obviously, this is much bigger than where we are, but you can start to see a lot of these components starting to coming together and into play and having those kind of orchestrated into an overall comprehensive design. And then the other thing to really think about on the plant material side, it starts to speak to the aesthetics as well as the seasonality of the park. We're all hardy in New England, and winter, we can't forget it. It could be a nice day. There could be snow on the ground, but it's sunny and not cold or windy, and people are itchy to get outside. So to make sure that those spaces are attractive, functional as well in the winter, as certainly the spring, summer, and the fall, which are certainly much easier. And using a lot of natives as well within the plant palette to keep the maintenance and the kind of the work effort there much lower. And also, it's a really good way to continue to promote our pollinators within the urban environment here, whether those are butterflies or bees. People don't think a lot about those things, but they're all really critical about our food production and our overall kind of community. So these are all great spaces, as well as certainly habitat as well for birds and other elements. And then finally, as far as slides, just wanted to think about, we talked briefly, and we'll talk about it in greater detail when we have the transportation meeting. But when we start to think about opportunities to increase some of the area for Gibson Park, as we start to look at how those ramps are configured, there may be opportunities to really build upon the amenity that you guys have. And we know that the tennis courts are currently used by the high school tennis teams. And I know there's a half court basketball over there, but is there a desire from the community's input if we were to be able to integrate more of a full-size basketball court? Are there needs or desires for more of a kind of a shade, shelter kind of element that would be out in the park? Starts to act as really kind of a hub and a gathering spot. You can imagine kids' birthday parties or community groups or whatnot that start to have a little bit of a gathering element within the overall park that could be something that could be really nice. Other kinds of kind of recreation, whether they're flexible, where you've got in the lawn, there's a lot of yard games you could do, but there's also bocce or other kinds of kind of more active, if you will, recreation that could certainly be involved or integrated into the park. I know that there's a program out there already regarding community gardening, but that may be something that could be increased if that's a need or a desire from the community standpoint. I don't know where you guys are and kind of the rules and the regs, if you will, for dogs within Gibson Park. If it's something that's an issue, we could start to think about having more of a designated area as a dog park that would be off leash, if that's something that would be appropriate. And then in the lower left too would be just I don't have a good idea on kind of the number of kids, and I'm sure Al has done a lot of that research or knows all of that, but is there a need for increasing the size of the playground, increasing the areas for maybe different ages of kids? Obviously, a lot of the parks are all 2 to 5 and 5 to 12, but just making sure we've got the play pieces there. And if we're good to go, that's great. That gives us space for other elements, but just start to ask questions of what other kind of park related opportunities we might be able to introduce into the design as we kind of look at the reconfiguration and kind of potentially gaining some space, as I mentioned, in the areas of the current ramp, off ramp kind of configuration that will, I think, lead to some real estate that will be an amazing amenity for the neighborhood as well.
So Bob, we can't really see anybody if there are any questions. Was there?
There are none at this time.
Can you? Okay.
I just want to add, I think a dog park would be a fantastic idea. I know a lot of folks down there have asked for one.
Yeah, it might be worthwhile, if, particularly from the community participants, we could get some feedback on some of what Sean has shown, because they're going to be coming back next week with some more specific ideas for Gibson Park in particular. Are there elements that Sean has reviewed, whether playgrounds or open space or green space or planting, that seem more or less attractive to the community? Jay, I see your hand is up. You want to comment?
Yeah, one of the things that I see, I have younger kids, and so them and their friends keep asking, where's the nearest skate park? And I'm like, I don't know, like these kids are in middle school, smaller high school grades, 9th and 10th grade, a place to ride their skateboard, like a little skate park. So I'm just tossing that out there on top of Eric's comment on the.
And there's some great ideas in Europe about skate parks doubling as resiliency. Some of the precedent images that Jay and John showed in terms of holding water and retaining it, and in using both those programs to have some synergy between it.
There's one other question from somebody that's identified only as numerals. Could you identify yourself and ask whatever question or whatever comment you want to make?
Yeah, my name is Eric Littman. I apologize. We're on an iPad trying to listen in. We live at 371 North Shore Road, which is actually right on the corner of Mills and North Shore Road. So the one comment I'd like to make is, as the previous gentleman spoke about a skate park, you know, this is also a pretty big ice hockey community. And it might be an option if I know the person presenting was talking about maybe a full court basketball court, if that could double in the winter and have availability to have a small skating rink, might be an option for, you know, where you could increase the use of the park, you know, to get kids to come out where they don't have to pay money to get some extra ice time in, have some stick practice, or just the community as a whole being able to skate.
I used to have a rink, kind of an all-season rink on Ocean Ave, right?
Yep.
So would something like that be, you know, something that you think would get a lot of use as well?
I personally think so. With the skyrocketing prices of youth hockey, and you know, everything with all youth sports turning into club teams, and right, the amount of money that it's almost becoming, you know, unaffordable. So I just think it gives, you know, the kids in the area, you know, a chance, you know, to get on some skates, and even if they're just figure skating or just having stick practice, whatever it takes, so they can enjoy, you know, the winter sport.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think once again that just kind of builds upon the extending the use of the park for all 4 seasons. I mean, I think those are great ideas.
So I just want to add to that. This is Julie tomorrow. In response to your question about an ice skating park outside, that is something that Revere Parks and Rec is actively looking into as part of a winter activation that's going on right now to get more people outside during the COVID response. One of the biggest challenges to bring something like that into a coastal community is oftentimes we don't meet the temperatures for 32 or below to keep the rink frozen for a long period of time. So even if we were to put amenities in to have that, we would need a real long cold spell for that ice to stay hard and to be skatable. But it has been something that has been looked into, just like a pop-up skating ring, ice skating ring for this coming winter.
Elaine Hurley, do you have a view on what you would like to see up there?
Another question.
Elaine
Hurley.
Yeah. I'd like to just add to that, and that's why the proposal that I in Boston area we used to use on our own as kids, exactly what the previous speaker talked about, is that it's got to get cold long enough. Well, if you doubled like a full-size basketball court and just had the availability in the winter to toss up some boards, I happen to have some knowledge within rinks to where it doesn't really cost anything per se to try to maintain ice. It's just if it does become available and it gets cold enough, all you have to do is just what we did as kids is just be able to flood it. And then to just be able to play and the, you know, there's obviously very little to no cost on something like that other than having the infrastructure in place to be able to just put boards up so you could maintain if you wanted to, if we knew or the city knew that there was a cold spell coming, it doesn't take too much to get, you know, somebody from DPW to come out, hook up to a hydrant and just flood the rink. That, I mean, that's, you know, you're not talking about a lot of manpower, a lot of overhead to do that. If the initial infrastructure is in place.
That's a good point, and I'm sure from what David said, it will be taken into account. I know Kevin O'Malley has a question, but before that, Elaine, were you going to say something, Elaine Hurley?
Yes, Bob, I was. As far as the dog park, I think that a lot of people are looking for, you can't believe how many people come down here to bring their dogs to the park. But all of that, anything we're going to do down there that's going to expand the park is going to depend on bringing the traffic in a different way.
Absolutely.
The people that come down for the ballpark to use for the games, and their mothers, most of them, they fly. So I think a lot of it's going to have to do with that. My question about parking, what are we going to do for parking? Do we have enough area to take on the parking for expanded?
Yeah, Elaine, that's definitely something that we'll look at. And I think what you said is exactly right as far as the access. And we'll definitely be talking about that in greater detail in the follow-up meetings. But we do have some opportunity. And I think it's a bit of a balancing, to be honest, to be able to build upon potential additional amenities for the park itself and balancing that with the ability to get to it. I'm hoping, and maybe I'm naive to think, but if we can make better and stronger bike and pedestrian connections as well for those that are closer that could get there without the car. I understand that's not the case on all issues, but kind of a balancing act of improving those non-car routes and at the same time, you know, kind of looking at those parking needs to make sure that it's all working together.
Parking demand will not be overlooked, Elaine, for sure.
I just want to touch on the boatyard. I know we're talking park, but the boatyard, I really would love to see something for the youth of the city, because there's really not a lot for the youth in the city to do, as to do with coastal, you know, fishing, boating, whether we can teach kids how to fish, teach kids how to row, teach kids how to drive a motorboat, you know, something for them to do. If we can look into that as far as, I don't know if we need the park part, but for the boatyard.
No, you're absolutely right, Elaine. And when we began thinking about community uses, things like community rowing and boating were high on the list of possibilities. So you can be sure that will be on the agenda for discussion next week.
Great, thank you.
Kevin O'Malley, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I have two questions, actually. The first is, are we sure that you are dealing with the true owner of the boatyard in your discussions, as there has been some confusion about actually who owns the boatyard and who has the right to make decisions regarding the sale or transfer of that property? And the second comment is that in looking around in Revere, I find that there are no public wharfs or docks for the use of people who want to pull their boat up to a dock and maybe onload folks who are handicapped or incapable of rowing out to a boat. So I'm wondering if consideration could be given to that. I think that piggybacks onto Elaine Hurley's comment that, you know, if we're going to use the river, Pines River particularly, for education or boating experiences for youth or people in general, we're going to need a public space to do that, like a public wharf, where people can bring their boats into, or boats could be stored or launched from. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, I will ask Sean to comment on the last one. I will say that particularly boat ramps, also involve issues of parking and storage, which we will need to take into account, but I'm sure Sean has some ideas along those lines. As for the ownership of the Riverside Boatworks, we're well aware of its checkered history. We do believe we know who owns the property now and is paying the taxes on it. We will be sure that we identify the true owner. I can assure you, Kevin, it sounds like a well-informed question, but believe me, we're very much aware of that issue and will address that.
Yeah, and Kevin, to your point on the boats, I mean, it definitely came up during last week's call as well. So it's definitely an element that's on the radar that we want to be able to explore and kind of work through the process. And once again, it's really understanding kind of the opportunities, if you will, to understand through the various government agencies to see how we are able to do that. And certainly John and Jay are a great resource as well. But we'll definitely have heard that and understand it. And we're certainly very supportive of that as well. I want to look for those opportunities and finding the right spots to be able to do that if we can.
Yeah, if I can just piggyback on that. We're certainly looking at getting access to the water side and to your ramp or a pier. A wharf is going to be a little bit more difficult for the Pines River, just because it's very shallow, really out for a long ways to get out to deep water where we get that 8-foot tide range in the river. It's going to become challenging, so it could be done. It's just probably going to be cost prohibitive. So more likely a boat launch would be an easier thing rather than being able to actually berth vessels and get them on and off, to have a long gangway that would rise and fall with the tides. That's a little bit trickier. We are certainly going to look into it. I just don't want to get people's hopes up for that right away, but we're certainly going to look into it.
I'd like to just say something about pier or wharf. Dredging out here is when we had the boatyard dredge, our the beach was as high as our street. We lost half of Mills Avenue, which the guys know that we had to put up Jersey barriers to hold the street back. It all went into that hole. It filled in that whole place where it was dredged. So I think we need to keep that in mind. It's just going to pull the beach, some more of the beach away.
If we dredge.
If there's dredging, I mean, you have to really seriously think about the dredging.
Oh, absolutely, and that's one of those things where we'd want to put in measures, talking about the geobags, something that would stabilize it, so it would keep it from slumping back in, because that's the worst thing where you just dredge it and 5 years later you got to dredge it again. It's just a never-ending cycle. We certainly don't want that, so we will consider that.
Takes our beach with it. We'll have no mills.
Yeah. Exactly. We don't want that.
Bob Marrow or John Shue, do you have any comments from the Point of Pines perspective? Bob?
Do you hear me, Bob?
Yep, we can.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what consequences might result from dredging. I think Elaine's point is that whatever is being considered when you're getting into that area, you absolutely need to consider all of the potential consequences. I'll just mention on the uses of that area. I would be a strong advocate as well as for the dog park. There's a lot of dogs in this neighborhood, and I think people would love to have something like that at the Gibson Park area.
John, do you have any comments along those lines?
The only comment I have is I do have a lot of experience with geobags and dredging. It is a good way to contain it where it won't slump. You put it in place. Other than that, I'm just kind of listening, taking it all in.
Very good. Thank you, John. Lisa Peterson, I believe, has a question. Lisa, would you identify your place of residence and your question?
Hi. Yeah, I live at 225 Mills Avenue, right next to the boatyard.
Okay.
I have a lot of just questions, but I don't know, putting in plant life between the river and Mills Ave, if you guys have looked at how little land there is there. I love the idea. I love the idea of having everything be purified before it goes back into the water, etc. But I'm just not sure, you know, where the tide pulls everything back out with it, how that would work.
John or Sean, you want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, I think the challenge is typically getting it established. I think once we get it in place, we're in a good place. I think the other challenge is typically those coastal environments are sensitive and don't like a lot of foot traffic, particularly repeated, where things get beaten down, and then you start to create openings, and it kind of thrives as a network. So I think in order for us to pull this off successfully, I think there's a lot of really good stabilization and resiliency things to gain from that. But in order to make that work, we need to be able to be understanding of access points or how people can get to the water. I think we don't have one answer here. I think it has to work as a system in order for that to be successful. But I think your points, Lisa, are really valid, and we just need to be smart about how we propose that and where we propose that.
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate the same comment that there is not one solution that's going to be just applied the entire length of the riverfront. We're going to look at different solutions depending on the conditions and the use.
Frank Stringy has something.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to the team. We've had discussions on this. We're looking towards working with our natural processes in that area rather than against them. So all the resiliency measures that are going to be put into place are taking advantage of the existing environment and not working against it. So that leads to the discussion we've been having with a lot of the residents on this call is to work with the environment and not against it. So a lot of the resiliency measures that come out of this discussion and shoreline protection will include a lot of those measures.
And that's an old conversation that you've been having for many decades, correct?
A long
Frank?
time.
Yeah. Okay, I think David, are we to L. Baker to give us a review of some of the things that are going on in terms of resiliency planning otherwise?
Exactly, Bob.
Hi, everyone. I touched upon a few of these things, so I'll sort of breeze through. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in at any time. But just to, in reference to the scope of this project and other simultaneous projects, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Action Grant is for a feasibility study for the Riverside area and Point of Pines all the way down one, and then looping back all the way down Route 1A to the Wharf Restaurant. And that project was a result of many hours in workshops at the Point of Pines Yacht Club, where we talked about resiliency measures that were needed across the city. And that one sort of rose to the top. So that brought us to give that the most attention for the next opportunity for a grant. The hazard mitigation plan is a 5-year citywide plan to plan against natural disasters. So that's going to be happening and kicking off in the next probably 4 weeks, sort of on the heels of this. So that will be citywide, which will also incorporate any measures that we identify from this particular project, as well as the MVP. And that is, that's a federal plan as opposed to MVP, which is our plan with the state. Just to touch on also the Metropolitan Planning Organization, read our MVP report, findings report, and identified that this was going to be their first resiliency study for a major corridor. So they chose Route 1A through Revere, and this rose to the top for them because of the times that we had back in 2018 and previous to that, having the roadways closed and cutting off any emergency response to a large portion of the area. That they are a boatyard. We're working with Collins Engineering on that project to identify what might be done for community boating elements on that property, what's feasible, what is not. That sort of came to light a little bit before this grant, but through COVID was tabled for a little while. So it's actually running a little bit simultaneous. And all of the engineers from Collins, from this project and from MVP have met over the past week so they can collaborate on ideas so we're all on the same page. Other elements that came out, the new fire station, as most of you know, that's in the pipeline, and that is set to be in motion, I would say, within the next year. I'm not going to speak too much on that.
Thanks to John Collins,
John Powers.
John Powers, I might add, yes.
So, so thanks for your advocacy on that. That was also something that was identified in the MVP plan a couple of years back, mainly because of the flooding issues and the fact that that area can be really difficult to get to with beach traffic in the summer, as well as flooding issues, cutting off access to those areas. And we've recently put in a application with the Army Corps of Engineers to revisit a study that was completed 28 years ago. There are many people on the call and in this room that were very close to that project for a long time. It went almost to implementation for floodgates across running right where the General Edwards Bridge is in front of there, that would mitigate flooding for all of the estuary behind there, the Pines River and Saugus River area. So that was really a regional project, and we're hoping that they will bring that study back to light and revisit the possibilities for flood mitigation, significant flood mitigation for that area for the long term. That project would be many years out. It's very expensive. But I did want to mention the fact that, you know, we did submit that application to revisit the study, and it was Revere, Saugus, Lynn, Malden, and Everett that all signed on for that regional application. And last but not least is the Mass DOT project for the General Edwards Bridge. Julie's been spearheading conversations with them over the last couple of months, and they do have in the pipeline to rebuild that bridge. It would be built adjacent to that bridge and would not be a drawbridge, would be higher elevation. And their ramps, the ramps may be impacted as a result of that. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. But just to let you know that that project is in the pipeline. It is a Mass DOT project. We have been at the table, but that can be as much as, you know, 5 years before it goes into full planning mode, and probably at least 8 to 12 years out before we really see any action on that. So just to know in the back of your head that eventually it's coming. Paul's nodding at me from the other side of the table, but it is in the pipeline, but we can't really speak to the timeline other than we know that, you know, it's on their list and we have been at the table for discussions.
What's worthy of note in that regard, however, is our discussions with MassDOT have suggested that we can approach the issues of the ramps to and from the new bridge, as well as the local circulation in Revere, before the bridge actually gets built. So we may be able to come up with some solutions to our access and egress issues in the context of this discussion before the bridge rather than after the bridge. So even if the bridge is delayed, we can do what we need to do in Revere to make happen some of the things that we're talking about around this table. The other thing I would note is that a lot of the interventions that have been suggested are fairly expensive. And it's very important in that regard that this master planning effort is being funded by the Seaport Economic Council, because if out of this comes some feasible ideas, there are funding possibilities through the Seaport Council that are very significant and very timely. And I would just ask Paul Rupp, who was responsible for getting the grant that allowed this to move forward, to talk a little bit about that. And I know Jay Borkland also has some experience with infrastructure funding from the Seaport Economic Council. Paul, could you start?
Yeah, John also has a lot of experience in working with Seaport. The city certainly could have pulled together the resources to do this master planning effort, but there's a method to the madness. Seaport is a very, very interesting, small, nimble agency, and it works from working port facilities, actual, ship unloading equipment to regional flood protection measures, to recreational measures, And it's really been expanding its mission over time. The important thing is that it forms partnerships with its communities. And that's what we're trying to do here. We come out of this planning exercise with a master plan, and we become partners with Seaport over a period of years to do certain pieces, to find other resources to complement. And we begin to build out what we have pictured here. I can point to some communities that I've worked with anyway that have done this. Winthrop, it's Town Landing and Town Pier and ferry service, all mainly funded by Seaport, some other funds as well. Saugus now beginning a river walk project. Those are two I've worked on. And in Salem, the Harbor Walk that keeps expanding is mainly funded by Seaport in the city. Gloucester seawalls and shipping facilities and fishing facilities, plus recreational facilities and tourist-oriented types of infrastructure. So the point being, we're going to form a partnership with Seaport, and we're going to walk down the road with them together, and we're going to do certain projects with them, and we will do other parts of the master plan with other entities. So this is a beginning of a process, and it's a great beginning. I'm anxious to get the first application in for a real project after this concludes. So,
and Jay and John, as Paul indicated, you've worked with funding from this source, among others, in the past. I know Fall River, for example, has been among your accomplishments. Do you want to just speak to that and kind of the scale of support that they're able to provide?
Yeah. Yes, sure. That I've been working with projects related to Seaport Council for about 25 years. Have secured about $200 million in funding for port communities up and down the coast. The Seaport was originally founded to focus on the 5 main shipping ports in Massachusetts so that Massachusetts could retain its maritime trade and economy. Gloucester, Salem, Boston, New Bedford, and Fall River. And but it's been expanded, as Paul has mentioned, to really include all of the coastline of Massachusetts, because there's a recognition that the coastline of Massachusetts is a big part of the state's identity. And so there are funding programs that start, and once you get into the pipeline, essentially, it becomes easier and easier to get funding through the Seaport Council. And we've been involved with projects that have been as small as $25,000 or $30,000, all the way up to $100 million marine terminal reconstruction. So there is a certain amount of annual funding that one has to work within, but it's a really good program. And some of your neighbors to the north, in particular, Paul mentioned Winthrop, but Lynn and the ferry docks there were created through Seaport Council. Swampscott is getting quite a bit of money for a seawall repair and a living reef installation for resiliency. Salem, the ferry dock for the ferry to Boston, as well as the harbor walk that was mentioned. Gloucester maintaining the fish pier and removing debris from their channels and keeping their piers up. So it's a really good program. And I think we all would highly encourage Revere to continue to follow that thread, because once you make a friend with Seaport, they stick with you.
The point being that the kind of significant and expensive interventions which have been reviewed as precedents today are actually not fanciful. They are realistic possibilities if we pursue them in a systematic way in the context of this master plan. David, maybe it's time to turn it back to you. We're looking to the next meeting to focus on some more site-specific issues and opportunities for Gibson Park, Riverside Boatworks, etc. Do you want to just set up that discussion for next week?
Yeah, I think that's right, Bob. So I think the point of these last 2 slides is really to try to pull out some more conversation about the precedents. I think we've done that pretty well, and we have a lot of notes and a good sense of some initial thoughts here. And what we want to do is take these ideas, these concepts, and develop a preliminary plan that we'll bring to you next week to to talk about how we can implement some of these strategies specific to this site and deal with, we may not have the final plan, and we definitely won't have the final plan. What we'll do is probably look at some options. We'll develop a plan. We'll have some options for different areas, and then you kind of walk through that and talk through that with you. It's a little different doing this remotely, obviously, so we'll do our best to try to find ways to make it interactive and to work with you to kind of live make some adjustments where we can.
We're close to the end of the session, within about 5 minutes. Is there any other final comments or questions that any of the members of the audience or of the advisory group would like to pose, just to set the consultant team up for next week? Hearing none and seeing none, unless I'm missing something, can we switch back to, go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to make sure you guys know how bad the boatyard floods. The whole site floods with the water goes all the way up to the Hayes Ave, and then it comes down to River Ave. Just so you know, I mean, whatever we're going to plan on putting in there, it has to be able to withstand water, or you can put a building in there with blow away. That's all. I just want to make sure that they knew that.
Okay, I think John Powers. John, you have something you want us to end with?
Yes, I do, and I feel it incumbent upon me to mention this to all of the members of the committee. And there's a building at North Shore Road. It's probably less than a half a mile from Mills Avenue. It's a large building. I'm sure everybody's seen it. About 2.5, 3 years ago, I started working on that so that we could gain control of that building. Well, I spoke with the outside attorney, Jerry D'Ambrosio, last week, and he tells me that the city of Revere now owns that building. They had over $300,000 in outstanding liens because of the condition and the way they were maintaining the building.
John, that's the former, what is it, storage building south of the wharf?
Yeah. And I also asked outside attorney why, they were still keeping trucks down there. And the answer is very clear that they have filed for bankruptcy. And because of the fact that they filed for bankruptcy, there's nothing we can do there now, although we have a judgment of sorts. We do own that building. So when Kevin O'Malley started speaking of some type of a launching area that would accommodate boats and maybe vehicles for senior citizens, so they would have access to the river, that was one of the things that came to my mind. So I just want to pass it along so that we're all on board and all knowledgeable of the fact that that does exist. Thank you.
Okay. David, are you familiar with the property John is referring to?
We're looking at the map trying to figure out which one it is specifically.
Can you say it again, John? The road?
Well, if you
and what?
It's right almost next to the Marina Restaurant.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just further south of the Marina Restaurant. It's sort of behind the beach house on the boulevard in that vicinity.
And the only building between that and the restaurant, Marina Restaurant, is a Broad Sound Tuna Club, fishing club down there.
Yeah, and there's a Dunkin' Donuts there as well.
There's a Dunkin' Donuts there, yeah.
We see the Dunkin' Donuts.
There's a house in back, yeah.
And that's a marina that actually functions right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that does. The marina does, yeah. But this building does not function. This building, we own it.
Okay, we'll certainly take that into account, John. Anything else, Jessica? Okay, I guess we've succeeded with our first meeting to get a lot of input, and we'll look forward to the next meeting to get a lot of output. So I thank everyone for being with us today, and we'll look forward to everyone being with us next week. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.